Hi everyone. In this video, I will walk you through the questions and answers for Journal Club assignment number 4. We will be answering questions about the sampling strategy and design for this assigned article. The article is the Karyotaki article from 2019. It is a study protocol. That means that this is a proposal or a description of the procedures for a random control trial. So this is like your project in that it will not have a results section. It is just going to have all of the information about the procedures of a proposed study. And the study that they have done is on a web-based intervention for college students with depression and anxiety. So let's go ahead and get started by looking at the first question. So the first question is about the research problem, purpose, or process. And this question should be familiar to you because it's been in other assignments. It asks, what type of purpose does the study have? So this question is asking, is it descriptive, exploratory, explanatory, or evaluative? And the purpose of this study is evaluative because it is aiming to evaluate the effectiveness of this intervention. The next question is, what study methods were used? And in this study, all of the methods that were used were quantitative methods. And I know this because the data were collected using self-report questionnaires mainly, and just one structured interview. So, whenever it's a clinician rated structured interview, that means that these ratings that the clinicians give are usually a code, which is a number. And so, numerical data is generally quantitative. And we use statistical procedures that are based on mathematical principles to analyze the data. So that's how we know that this is quantitative. Number 3, do the authors identify a theoretical framework that guided their study? Let's switch back to the article and take a look. Usually you will find this information in the literature review. So if we go and we look at the introduction, keep scrolling, I'm looking for the word theory, and I'm not seeing it. So I'm going to assume that the authors are basing this off of ideas they have from what they know from previous research, but they haven't identified a specific theory. So for your answer, it's fine for you to say that the authors didn't identify a specific theoretical framework. And number 4, you are going to, in your own words, write about what the primary aims or research questions that this study hopes to address. Be sure to use your own words here. Do not copy and paste from the article. That is considered plagiarism. And I also don't want you to do direct quotes because I want you to practice paraphrasing. So let's go back to the article and Where we will find this information is usually at the end of the literature review. And you'll see that that's exactly where we find this here, is after the introduction and the literature review. The authors spell it out very nicely for us in this objectives section, where they talk about the primary objectives, which are depression and anxiety. So they want to test the effectiveness of this new web-based intervention on depression and anxiety. They also have secondary objectives. So the next thing they want to know is, are there participant characteristics that moderate treatment outcome? So, for example, they might want to know, do students who have higher GPAs or higher IQs, do they have different treatment outcomes than students with lower IQs? Or do women have better outcomes from this treatment than men? They also want to examine acceptability. Acceptability is basically another word for satisfaction. The authors actually even use a satisfaction scale to measure this. And this is just, how happy the participants were with the treatment. Then, lastly, they are wanting to know if the intervention affects two other outcomes. Does it prevent university dropout? And does it increase educational achievement? They also give us a hypothesis here. They hypothesize that the interventions will outperform the control condition in reducing depressive and anxiety symptoms. So that is their main hypothesis. They think that this new intervention is going to do a better job at reducing symptoms among college students than treatment as usual. Let's flip back over to our questions. So you'll see the way that I chose to word this was that the authors primarily are evaluating whether a guided web based trans-diagnostic, individually tailored intervention is more effective in reducing anxiety and depression among college students than treatment as usual. And I also summarize what their other aims were. All right, let's move along to variables. So these questions are going to ask us first about our independent and dependent variables. These questions should be very familiar to you because you have answered these questions before. And each one of these questions, be sure to answer every component of the question. So you'll see that it asks, what is the independent variable? How is it operationalized? And what level of measurement are they measured at? And whenever we're talking about levels of measurements, we're not talking about the actual scales that were used. We are asking whether it was measured at the nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio measurement. So, in this particular article, we'll flip back to the article. We can find this information about independent and dependent variables if we scroll to the data analysis section. So, we're going to keep scrolling. And all the way down here in statistical analysis. In this section, it will tell us what the independent and dependent variables are. The independent variable is the type of what group it was put into. And so whether people were randomized to the um, control group or to the intervention group. And so the way that I word this here is that the independent variable is the group condition or the intervention type. It's operationalized by assigning groups to one of the two groups. One is receiving web-based intervention, and the second receives intervention as usual. That's the control group. And because this places participants in groups, this is nominal or categorical. So it's measured at the nominal level. The dependent variables get a little tricky, but we're going to focus mainly on depression and anxiety because those are the two main dependent variables. And we can find this information in the assessments section. So let's scroll back up and look, we're at primary outcomes. So the primary outcomes are depression, which is measured by the Patient Health Questionnaire, also known as the PHQ-9, and the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Scale. And this is also called the GAD-7. These are the two main outcomes, and these are the scales that are used to measure them. So let's go back and talk about how you would write this up. So the main dependent variables are depression and anxiety. Depression is operationalized using scores on the PHQ-9, and anxiety is operationalized or operationally measured using scores on the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Scale. Both of these dependent variables are measured using the ordinal scale because these scales have Likert type scales for each item, and those are generally considered ordinal. But as we've discussed before, even though technically they're ordinal, researchers usually treat them as interval or ratio so that they can run more sophisticated statistical analyses. You also may want to include that they were interested in some of these other outcomes. And two of particular interest are college dropout and academic achievement, because these researchers chose to use a self-report questionnaire where they developed their own questions about dropout and academic achievement rather than using existing records. So rather than to find the transcripts of these students. Number one, because that would be time consuming and probably expensive, but also there are ethical and privacy concerns. All right, so let's think about control variables. First, let's think about the definition of control variable again. So a control variable is basically a moderating variable. And moderating variables are also sometimes called extraneous variables. So variables that influence the relationship between the DV and the IV that aren't the intervention itself. And so sometimes in statistical analyses and in our research design, we can control for some of these variables, the extraneous variables, and hold them constant so we can remove their influence. So we can know that it's not because of these things, it's because of the intervention. So in this particular study, they did not name any variables as control variables, but they were interested in moderating relationships, particularly between participant characteristics and treatment outcomes. But these were not considered control variables. These were just moderating variables that they were interested in. All right, next question. Do the authors offer a hypothesis? They do offer a hypothesis. So if we go back up to our outcomes section at the very end, this is our hypothesis. And they hypothesize that the web-based intervention will outperform the control conditions. So the students who receive the web-based intervention should have better reductions in depression and anxiety than the students in the control condition. And this matches their research purpose very well because it's an evaluative research purpose. And this hypothesis is clearly evaluating the effectiveness of this new web based intervention. All right, let's switch back over to our questions. Next, we're asked, what were the sources of the data for the variables? So this question is asking about data collection. How did they collect the data from the participants? In this particular study, they had several points in time that they collected data. All of the measures were collected using self-report questionnaires through an online platform called Qualtrics. The only measure that was not administered that way was the mini international neuropsychiatric interview, which has to be conducted by a clinician. And so it was conducted by trained researchers via a telephone interview. All right, the next questions are about sampling. Let's go to the article and look for the recruitment section because in this article, that is where we find the most relevant information to answer these questions. Recruitment, down at the bottom of page 6. So it says that participants were recruited from Dutch universities and colleges. And they did it 2 ways. So through emails and advertisements that targeted college students to let them know about the study. And the researchers had them sign up for information about the study. They were sent reminders if they signed up to do the screening questionnaires. And then secondly, they had study advisors and student mentors and ambassadors let college students know about the study. So this would be like the college counselors on their campuses, student government, to spread the word and let people know about the study. So this is not a random strategy. This is a non-probability sampling strategy. It could be considered purposive or convenient. So they are only targeting college students. So they are only recruiting people from college campuses. They're not just putting a post on the web saying college students we need you. They are targeting locations that they know they can find college students on college campuses. And it is a convenient sample because they don't use all college campuses, even not all college campuses in the Netherlands where this was taking place. In one part of the article, they mentioned that there really were two primary sites that they collected this information from. So, this is a convenient sample. So, why would the authors use this technique whenever we know that random sampling helps us to have the most generalizable sample, the most representative sample? So, the main reason is that it would be really difficult to find a list of all of the college students in the Netherlands. That might be impossible to find. It may be impossible to obtain the list because not all universities might readily provide that information. And so they were limited, the authors were, to universities that they had existing relationships from. And so this is good, and the advantages is that it's quicker, it costs less. Usually, you're able to draw a larger sample, but the disadvantage is that it doesn't control as well for external validity, and so it's not as generalizable. The findings are not as generalizable to your population. All right, the last two questions here are about study design, which is what you guys are learning about in week 5 material. So, for this, let's go and look at this table on page 5. This is table 2, and it's the overview of measures and assessment points. And you'll find that it tells you, the 5 different times that they took data, and then mark an X by which one of these measures they did. So we know that this is a repeated measures design in some ways because they don't just do a pretest and a post-test, but they continue to collect data after the post-test. So there are multiple measures here. We also know if we go to the intervention and the treatment as usual, that we have 2 groups. If you scroll down, there's a randomization section. So right here on page 6, randomization, we know that the researchers did random assignment to the intervention group or the control group. Randomization means that we have a experimental design. Randomization is kind of the cornerstone of experimental designs. And with randomization, we can control for a lot of different threats to internal validity. So let's go back and look at the questions. So it says, what study was used? So it was experimental because there is randomization. We know that there was a pretest and a post-test, but there was a control group. And then there were repeated measures after the post-test. This also is described sometimes as a random controlled trial whenever there are these repeated measures after the post-test, added on to a pre-test, post-test control group design. The researchers collect data at 5 different points. So they do it at a screening and baseline measure. They do it at a second collection point of baseline data, then at post-treatment, which was just 7 weeks after randomization, so immediately following the intervention. And then time 3 was 6 months out, and then time 4 was 12 months out. So with this design, now we are being asked is how well does this design control for internal validity? And the answer is that it controls for most threats to internal validity, particularly because of random assignment. This ensures equivalence of the two groups. So it means that we know that since the participants are randomly assigned to the two groups, that all of the things that might be different about those participants are equally distributed between the two groups. So any of the things that are different about the participants that could be variables that affect whether they get better or not, they're equally distributed between the two groups. So we can assume that the two groups that we're looking at are pretty much the same because of the logic of randomization. So, firstly, we know that selection bias is controlled for because it is randomly assigned. We can also know that regression to the mean, maturation, and history would be well controlled for because both groups would be just as likely to experience these things over the course of the experiment because they were randomly assigned to each group. Now, there is one weakness of this design, which is testing, especially since we have several measures and time points. It's going to be hard for us to show that there weren't testing effects. So, if we're giving the same scale 5 times over the course of a year, the participants might get used to the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7 and know what it's measuring. And so their knowledge of that may influence how they answer those questions, and rather than it being the intervention itself. So I hope that this video helps you to understand the group article that was assigned and how to think about the questions for the journal club assignment number 4.